Good morning. Today is the second Sunday of Lent. 2 weeks ago, I suggested that one way to prepare for Lent was to read the full Gospel of St. Mark. The Gospel itself is not really long. A person could sit down and read the Gospel of St. Mark about an hour. The reason I suggested that is because sometimes when we read the Gospel fully, we get a better picture, a better idea of the writer's goal. And the Gospel section today from St. Mark really proves that. Jesus begins his work how? Jesus comes and he meets John the Baptizer. And Jesus goes into the river and John baptizes Jesus. And the gospel says Jesus came out of the water and God says, "This is my beloved Son. Pay attention to him." Now, the gospel today tells us again that Jesus is on the mountain with three of the apostles and Moses and Elijah. And again, the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. Pay attention to him." That message about Jesus is God's Son happens one more time in the Gospel of St. Mark. It happens when Jesus is on the cross and he dies. And this time, the voice is not from God the Father. The voice is from a Roman soldier. He's not Jewish. He doesn't believe anything, but that soldier sees Jesus on the cross, and the soldier says, "This truly was God's Son." So St. Mark writes the gospel to teach us that God lets us know who is Jesus. Jesus is his Son. But at the end of the gospel, Mark is saying, now it's your turn to realize and to proclaim, that's right, Jesus, for me, is God's Son. And we have that first reading, a beautiful story about Abraham. And God tells him, "I want you to sacrifice your son." And Abraham's thinking, "My son?" But God's testing his faith. Are you willing to trust me? And the same thing in the second reading, where St. Paul says, in the world, what can separate us from God if we really believe? This week we have two wonderful examples of people who believed in God's proclamation and promise. Two different people. The first one is Saint Catherine Drexel. She was a religious sister who was from Philadelphia, and she worked and worked. She traveled on setting up Catholic schools all over the country for children who were poor. And she lived a long life. She lived to be 97 years old, and she died in 1955. The next day, March 4th, is the feast of St. Casimir. He was a young man who became a prince, a ruler of a country. He only lived to be 25 years old, and he died in 1484. But short life. Focused on what? Himself? No. Focused on helping those who were hungry, rejected, who were poor. Two different people, a man and a woman. Two different times, two different countries, two different situations and cultures and languages and everything. But each one believing in Jesus as God's Son and going out into the world to make the world a better place.